Welcome everyone to another episode of In a Nutshell, the fortnightly podcast hosted by Natural Gas World, where we look at the global news and trends in the gas industry. My name is Joseph Murphy, and today we are discussing the 2020 gas report published by Asia Pacific Energy Research Center, which looks at the key role natural gas continues to play in the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation member states. The nature of these gas markets, and of course the impact that COVID-19 and the recent spike in demand caused by cold winter weather has had. Today I'm joined by Glen Sweetnam, APERC's Vice President and a co-author of the report. Hi, Glen.
Good morning, Joseph. Nice to meet you.
You too. Along with Diego Rivera Rivota, a researcher at the organization. Hi, Diego.
Hi, Joseph. Thanks for having us.
So I think a good starting point before we cover some particular topics in depth is if you could just walk me through the report's key findings. Maybe, Diego, you could start.
Absolutely, Joseph. So this is a part of an annual report. This is the third time that we're doing it. And basically what we aim to do is look at an update of what happened that year in each of the 21 APEC member economies. And as a global, one of the main findings is that all 21 APEC economies overall together represent about 57% of global gas consumption and about 60% of global production. At the same time, in terms of trade, the region counts with 3 of the top 5 exporters, that is Russia, the United States, and Canada, as well as 3 of the top 5 importers, Japan, China, and the United States. That being said, in LNG markets, in terms of LNG, of course, like APEC has some of the largest importers, Japan, China, Chinese Taipei, and Korea. So that to be said, APEC member economies play a huge role in gas natural markets, and increasingly so, because it also accounted for 57% of market of demand growth in the past 10 years. So as a consequence, it's a pivotal role in which all APEC member economies play in natural gas markets. Then 2020, of course, was a very interesting year, very challenging in every aspect of social, economical, and any sphere of human life. And natural gas markets were not the exception of this, of course. And in terms, just very quickly, the impact that COVID-19 had on the 21 economies was very different, but overall meant a decrease on demand of about 1%, which is below the global average. And in the production front, there was also a decrease of about 2%, which is also below the global average that we saw, which was around 3%. And then we could see, depending, and we can later touch upon the details and how different it was. But just to put it a couple extremes, we can see China, in which gas demand actually grew, pipeline imports grew, production did so too, and LNG imports did so as well. Whereas in other economies, particularly the United States, for instance, or others like Mexico, had the exact opposite trend. So that was a big, really roller coaster ride, not only in terms of demand, supply, and trade dynamics, but also, of course, on prices, in which we saw on the first half of the year, of course, minimal lows on all main benchmarks. And then we saw a recovery on the second half of it. And then a drastic spike, as we remember, in late December. And even after the report finished its timeline recently in February, we saw this energy crisis because in Texas, which just reminds us the importance of natural gas, diversification, energy security, along other important issues. So I would say that's what it sums in the analysis. And there are 3 dynamics that we identified that are important in coming years. One is the impact of Chinese piped imports through the power of Siberia from Russia to China. The other one is the increasing presence of Southeast Asian economies in LNG imports, especially in Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia, but also in Vietnam and the Philippines, which are soon to join the LNG importing club. And finally, of course, what is going to be the role of natural gas on the recovery of COVID-19, but also in the transition to low carbon systems, in which we will have again a very diverging picture and role for natural gas across the 21 economies.
Okay, so quite a few extensive topics. Glenn, would you like to add anything about the report's findings?
Yeah, absolutely. And Diego, I think, did an excellent job of summarizing it. I think one of the things that makes us so interested in the region is the fact that, as Diego mentioned, it is growing faster than other regions. And especially as the large economies look to decarbonize their economies, the role of natural gas is going to be key. And China in particular, which is still very dependent on coal, how they decide to decarbonize, what role natural gas will play, will really have a large effect just because of the size of that market on the overall gas market, both pipeline and LNG markets.
Mm-hmm. And if I could just focus on the spike in prices we saw in December in Asia because of this big increase in gas consumption because of the winter, but also other factors. Well, firstly, I mean, what really caused this besides the cold weather? Because there were quite a few other factors in the mix, and how did markets behave as a result?
Right. Well, I think there's a couple factors that really caused the spot prices to spike. One, of course, is that a lot of the gas is traded under long-term contracts, so the spot market represented not the whole market, but just a portion of the market. But then I think very importantly, and this is something people are familiar with, is especially in the Pacific Basin region, storage is limited. And because we don't have easy access from the western coast of North America, any bottleneck in the Panama Canal or just in terms of transportation can really cause short-term disruptions. So I think it was this combination, as Diego has noticed, it was sort of a perfect storm of this very high demand combined with limited storage in the region, and then the fact that the infrastructure isn't fully developed on the west coast of North America, where you have so much supply, but it was difficult to get the supply where it needed to be in time.
Mm-hmm. And we had this big growth in spot prices. I'm just thinking, so in recent years we've seen buyers, a lot of buyers move closer towards spot purchases and away from long-term contracts. Do you think this event will make some reconsider that strategy and maybe favor long-term contracts whereas otherwise they wouldn't have?
This is fairly typical in energy markets, that spot prices will be lower than term prices for extended periods of time, and buyers will tend towards spot prices. You saw that in the California electricity market, where they only bought spot for power. This is a decade or two ago, but and then got caught short and wished they had the long-term contracts. More recently, that's exactly what we saw in Texas, where everyone was buying spot power. People weren't buying term power, weren't buying generation capacity. So I do think that this will cause a reconsideration of how much long-term gas do you want to have in your portfolio. But I think also these spot prices tend to, over time, there'll be a number of firms that will attempt to capture the benefits of new infrastructure in the area. So I think it has an effect of the high spot prices dampen out over time. To me, it's a reflection of a lack of maturity of the market, something that's being corrected but will take time to correct.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about the problems with storage. Which countries or which areas of big countries like China is this a big issue?
Well, I think it's a big issue, obviously, for the island countries and peninsula countries like Chinese Taipei, Japan, and Korea don't have large storage capacity. So storage is very expensive there. there is opportunity for gas suppliers to sell swing contracts, sell products where they're providing variable volumes. Clearly, China, with its oil and gas resources, has reservoirs that can use depleted reservoirs for storage, but that haven't developed that yet. So I think what is likely is that once the market and the infrastructure becomes more integrated between North America and Asia, a lot of the storage may turn out being in North America. Enormous amount of storage in the United States, which right now was not benefiting the market because of the constraints on transportation in December.
Mm-hmm.
If I may add to that, Joe,
please do.
I would say, like, all these topics, like particularly storage, then comes to very specificities of each of the economies. So, for instance, we have Japan, and I would say Japan, Korea, and Chinese Taipei share for some characteristics very important for LNG imports and demand. One is that they lack domestic production. It's negligible or almost non-existent. The other one is they don't have international pipeline interconnections. Therefore, they depend solely on LNG imports. Fourth one, they do not have, South Korea does to a certain extent, but they do not count with an interconnected pipeline system within their territory. And fourth, as we mentioned, their storage capability is limited to what they have in the storage tanks in terminals, which in comparison to the international standards, it is relatively high for LNG storage terminals, but it is relatively low, of course, as an overall benchmark, and evidently so much if we compare it to European or North American standards. On top of that, in the case of Japan, for instance, what drives the demand is power, right? Power generation. And Japan has a power system, in which half of the territory has one frequency and the other one another completely different. So there's not a lot of capability for transport of electricity, of this power generation. If it was not enough that the gas cannot flow from, say, north to south, power has also a very limited way of doing so. So it is very reactive to demand shocks, right? And so the problem in Japan was that this cold snap that was like way colder than what we expected in this time of the year suddenly had like this big spike from power generation that was not expected, and then it becomes overreactive, let's say, compared to other systems, right? That was a big. And then on top of that, just like one last element was that it just happened that some nuclear power plants were under safety revisions and were offline at the same time, because Japan faces this situation post Fukushima, which, by the way, we happen to cross the 10-year anniversary of that event. That it has meant that to have a very limited number of nuclear reactors, 9 at the moment, operational. And in this case, at that moment, if I'm not wrong, we had only about 3 or 4 operational. So that was really a perfect storm in the case of Japan. And then if we go to these specificities, then we'll see in Korea, for example, coal restrictions were another one. And then in China, it is more related to heating directly from natural gas, right?
Mm-hmm. Okay, and going back to COVID-19, so looking at 2020 as a whole, so there were a few things that stood out. One, I believe the report talks about how Russia saw the biggest decline in production out of any other member.
Correct.
Another thing, as you mentioned earlier, is the fact that Chinese gas consumption was still, compared to many other countries, very, very robust in a year, despite in a year where there was a global pandemic, which was quite amazing to see. Let's talk about Russia first. Why was Russia so badly affected by the crisis?
It's a very interesting question, and it's, I guess, like as with many things with COVID-19, even beyond the natural gas sector, energy markets, it emphasized or it accentuated trends that were coming. And in this case, I think Russia, on one hand, domestic demand was not growing, and it has not been doing so for for a number of years.
Mhm.
The gas demand from Europe also, or gas demand for Russian gas imports has been decreasing at the expense of LNG imports mostly, but also a decrease, from power generation coming up from renewables and other sources that have phased out Russian gas. So I would say the most important shock came from the destination of their main source of imports, which is Europe, of course, Western Europe, whole of Europe, really, if we speak more broadly. And that was one of the main reason that it was affected from that demand shock for Russia. And the on a second important aspect is our LNG Russian exports actually saw a minimal decrease, nothing compared to this production. So this means that in spite of a relatively stabilization or small decrease in LNG exports, the shock on piped imports or on piped exports was so high that it could not balance that.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we may see that change with the Power of Siberia pipeline, which became operational at the end of the year, and the expansion further on. So Russia's situation of being so dependent on European demand centers may well change as the pipelines to China get completed.
And going back to China, what was driving this big increase in consumption last year, despite the impact of the pandemic?
Yeah, Joe, that's a great question, and it's actually there's a very interesting answer and dynamics coming in. So I wonder if we could look at the slide number 11. This one, perfect, excellent. So here we have the monthly natural gas demand in all 21 economies and their change from 2020 to 2019. And so if we look at China in the light red color, then we notice the pattern along the year. And so let's summarize it by saying that China, of course, was the first country that was hit by the pandemic, and it was on the month of January where we saw a decrease there, heavy restrictions on transport, on industry, a decrease in output, of course, and in general in mobility life. However, after and starting on the month of February, we did see an increase on output, on economic life, on economic growth. And China is one of the few economies in the world which registered actually a positive number on GDP growth itself. So if we look at what drives natural gas demand in China, it actually has a part of the reason there. Industrial output increased in China, and so did gas demand. But not only that, there are two other events that took place there and are very important for that. One of it is the increase of access to natural gas in residential and commercial sectors, in the building sector. And this is due to the increase on pipeline capacity, both domestically, creating more interconnections and connections to new buildings, but also to within LNG terminals, and also the power of Siberia coming from the north, and then the domestic network increasing from north to south. That led to an increase in gas demand in the building sector. On the one hand, on places where there was no access to natural gas, but also it delivered increased volumes at a lower price in places where before it was too scarce or too expensive. So that combination of factors led to an actual increase that we can see in the graph all the way March, September. It was irregular, of course, like July, it had an actual decrease. But then we can see in the month of October, and to a lesser extent in the month of November, when there's a growth on it again from the building sector and the industrial one. One factor that, now that we're speaking of China, one last thing that I want to stress and mention because of the relevance of it was the establishment and the start of operations in September of last year of Pipe China, the newly established state-based corporation that conglomerates midstream infrastructure for crude oil, petroleum products, and natural gas. And basically, they are going to be the owners and managers of most of the LNG terminals and pipelines across China. This is a major development, in my opinion, that has taken place, and that leads to an increase of centralization, and it's a step a step towards third-party access, another set of reforms on the gas market sector that the Chinese government is pursuing.
Mm-hmm. And we were talking about the high prices in the cold weather in December, exposing the vulnerability of supply infrastructure. But looking at China, we've had the launch of the Power of Siberia over a year ago now, and China also benefits, of course, from Central Asian gas, a lot of LNG import capacity. So there, and also, as you mentioned, the unbundling process as we move towards third-party access. I mean, one of the aims of that, right, is to encourage more investment in domestic production. So, from a point of view of supply security, China's got a pretty strong outlook, hasn't it?
Indeed, it has been a very let's say aggressive or like global response to it. And let's remember that only 3 years ago, China in particular was affected by a cold snap and another perfect storm that took place there, where basically it took to extremes in which regions of China have been phasing out heating based on coal. And they didn't have coal because the government banned it, but they couldn't have access to gas either because LNG terminals were operating at their maximum capacity, and there was no domestic capacity in pipelines or storage to take the gas to these regions. So I think it's definitely a lesson learned from the past, and it just emphasizes the way things work in China, the way infrastructure development takes place in China, which is indeed in another pace and another way of decision-making processes compared to other economies within APEC and globally, of course.
Mm-hmm. And the outlook for gas demand will depend a lot to quite a big extent on policy towards decarbonisation. So, I mean, in contrast, in Europe, there's a lot of talk of phasing out some gas energy. And replacing the natural gas with renewable gases, biogas, hydrogen, what have you. Whereas in Asia, you've got this big coal capacity, which provides some room for gas to grow as countries are trying to get greener. Which countries in the region do you feel are more favorably looking at gas as a solution for decarbonisation, and what about on the other side, which are kind of less enthusiastic about gas?
That's a great question. Actually, the answer is very interesting. So out of the 21, very diverse basket of countries, of economies in APEC, we only 3 of them have a participation of natural gas of less than 10% of their total primary energy supply. For all of them, for 18 of them, gas represents, a very important part of the global mix. Those 3 are Philippines, China, and Chile. And I'll start from that part of the question. Where will natural gas may not play a pivotal or key role in the decarbonization process? I would say Chile is a good example of that, in which New Zealand would be another one. New Zealand is one of the few countries also in APEC that do not trade natural gas. So they have a already very clean power generation mix, and they are pursuing, at the legal level, even, net zero policies, strategies, in which natural gas do not have a major role to play. That being said, though, there are other economies that are exactly on the opposite role, and in where natural gas has a major role to play. And those of them, normally, their main reason of that is that they have a very heavy mix or very important share of coal, not only in their power generation mix, but also in other sectors such as residential and commercial heating. One of them, and the largest one, is of course China, right? Which also announced their net zero aim target to 2060. But others that I would like to emphasize, and I'll go straight to there, is one that we often do not hear a lot, which is Chinese Taipei, in which nuclear is to be phased out by 2025. Coal capacity is also to be phased, decrease its capacity quite strikingly. And then LNG is being used in their 2 LNG receiving terminals, almost operating at maximum capacity. They have projects for developing 2, even 3 importing terminals additional to them, to the existing ones, but they have faced some obstacles to it. However, the government goal is to increase quite significantly their LNG imports. Another very interesting example is Thailand, in which actually demand has been increasing for LNG. There, the panorama is a bit different because it's a mix. The total primary supply, or the total gas supply in Thailand, is fed by decreased domestic production, piped imports from Myanmar, and LNG. And the 2 other sources have been decreasing, leaving space for LNG to grow. And that's actually feasible because the existing terminal actually is being operated at about 40% of its capacity. So that leaves room not only for Thailand to increase their LNG imports, but also to do or perform to a sort of hub in the future for other Southeast Asian economies. And one last case that I would like to emphasize, just because of their size, and again, this is something that sometimes we do not get quite into its profound or its depth, is Indonesia. Just the size of it, just in terms of their population, right? 280 million people around, disaggregated in a vast number of islands. That just leaves you a energy sector which is growing rapidly on the one hand, a very fast growing economy as well. Energy demand is growing quite fast, but also at the moment, power generation is dominated by coal. Domestic gas production is decreasing. And currently, the administration is not favoring a long boost or a large boost on LNG imports, but there is definitely room for it for the future, for the midterm and the long term that I would see there. And probably like the 2 last examples that I mentioned before, Philippines and Vietnam, again, 2 very large, countries, 100 million people, or on a little bit more in the case of the Philippines, and in which they are soon to join the LNG importing club. Both of these economies do not import natural gas, and they are soon to join the LNG imports club. And that would have definitely a great room for an increased participation of natural gas coming from LNG in the power generation mix.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And I suppose for for some countries, some of that you've mentioned, for example, Vietnam. So you have the interest in moving away from coal, moving to gas for environmental reasons, but it also means you're importing more of your energy, right? I mean, a lot of their coal comes. Is it domestic?
Correct. A lot of that share is domestic in many cases, but not all of it. For example, in the case of Vietnam, which both gas and coal production has been decreasing. But it's true that this part of energy security does play a role for that. And I would say, like in Southeast Asia, if we can find some common patterns, is one, yes, indeed, energy security is, let's say, a challenge for it. But more important for that, I would emphasize is affordability and just the cost effectiveness against coal, particularly with that. So that's really a major challenge that is a common obstacle across Thailand, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, even Malaysia, that it's quite present there. And at the same time, though, with the low prices that we've seen, particularly in the spot market over the past year, but also in 2019, it does make it even in those terms, LNG, natural gas in this region, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Please jump in.
Yes, in terms of the decarbonization, I think one of the keys that we're watching is, will gas be a baseload component in conjunction with carbon capture and sequestration, and thereby replace coal and decarbonize the economy? Or will gas more be considered just a backup fuel, in which case it would be there when solar and renewable, the other intermittents, aren't producing, but the total volume over the year would be much smaller. So in each of these countries, they're going to need to decide, are we going to focus on the electric generation from the renewable intermittent sources and use gas merely as a backup, in which case coal might be very competitive still too, or will there be progress in terms of carbon capture and sequestration, which would allow at relatively reasonable costs with development to decarbonize the gas, and it becomes a base load that also captures a major portion of the electric power generation market.
That's right. Those are great points raised by Glenn. And I would add just to that discussion that let's remember in these economies, the power generation plays a major role for gas demand, unlike, say, places in Europe, Russia, Canada, the US, where buildings, industry may play a larger role. Here it's really power regeneration what plays the major role for it. And also there's significant potential at most of cases not reach its maximum capacity or not optimized for renewable energy, right? Like for not only solar and wind, but also geothermal. Most of these economies are based on the Pacific Ring of Fire, which means that earthquakes are common, tsunamis so are, but also geothermal sources. And that's very important, for example, in places like the Philippines or Indonesia. So that's definitely a source of renewable or clean energy that has some future. And again, it doesn't receive that many reflectors sometimes. Definitely natural gas along with these sources can play a really important role towards decarbonization.
And also in the shipping industry as well, gas is expanding quite a lot in Asia. It's kind of left its homeland of Europe, especially North Europe, and now is building up quite a lot in Asia. That's another kind of opening for gas. Any closing remarks, guys, to the discussion?
Glenn?
Yeah, so I just think one of the areas that we didn't cover as much was U.S. production, which has been growing very rapidly in the Trump administration, both non-associated gas and then gas produced in association with the oil production, tight oil production. And that's a big part of what has undergirded the sort of the low prices that we've been speaking about. And so we'll all be watching what the Biden administration is going to do relative to natural gas over the coming years. Will U.S. gas production resume its growth, or will it be stymied by permitting issues associated with transportation and logistics? So I think that's an uncertainty. The uncertainty there and what happens in the U.S., and then also the uncertainty as to what China does. They, of course, have issued the first components of their 14th five-year plan, but until we see the details fleshed out, there's going to be a question as to whether a question about how much the gas will grow going forward. So it's those two, to me, are key uncertainties to be watching.
I mean, as for Biden's policy, I mean, the ban on oil and gas leases on federal land, is that a game changer? I mean, will that have a drastic impact on U.S. gas supply?
Yeah, it will have some impact. It will have some impact. A lot of the gas production is on private lands in the United States, so it's not the whole supply. But to me, one of the key issues is as the supply grows, there's new pipeline construction is needed, infrastructure construction, and I really think that's going to be the pinch point, is through the permitting process and the environmental regulations associated with the infrastructure that needs to be developed to produce the gas is really going to be key as to whether or not that supply source can grow.
Yeah, we recently had the blocking of the Keystone Pipeline for one example.
Exactly, that's a great example. Of course, that's oil, but
of course,
I think the same issues will apply for gas too. So it's going to be a key issue to watch going forward. There has been a lot of pushback in the United States from the labor unions to the canceling of the Keystone Pipeline and the threat of canceling other pipelines. So the president is going to have a hard choice on his hand as to whether to continue this sort of the environmental push to limit the ability to increase oil and gas production versus the jobs associated with those high-paying jobs associated with oil and gas industry.
Mm-hmm. And those US LNG exporters are kind of facing that environmental pressure at home, but also abroad, with buyers wanting increasingly stringent rules on the US gas they import.
Right.
So I think there was a deal.
Very important point.
Yeah.
And the industry really is focusing on this carbon capture and sequestration, which, given the reservoirs in the U.S. that could take carbon, not only depleted oil and gas reservoirs, but also CO2 reservoirs or aquifers if they have proper seals. So I think there's a lot of industry focus on that right now, and so that may be a way to address the European concerns about the green gas.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Anything else to add before we close things up?
Couple of things, just Joe. One, we spend most of the time speaking on the west side of the Pacific. I wanted just to mention very briefly Mexico. So for 10 years, pipe gas imports from the U.S. have been rising to its maximum every year, more than doubling, and it reached their maximum high even with the COVID pandemic last year. So that, apart from that increasing trend, it faces now the increased uncertainty on the one hand from nationalistic policies implemented by this administration, but also the urgent need for decarbonization policies. So it's very interesting to see what will happen within Mexico, within its power sector, and how that drives demand and U.S. gas imports, which account to about 60 billion cubic meters per year, which is one of the largest pipe trades in the world. And on the other hand, also in Mexico, but connected to the U.S., was that the only final investment decision of 2020 exactly took place in Mexico. ECA, Energía Costa Azul, which is an integrated terminal developed by Sempra, that will take gas LNG directly to the Pacific Basin, bypassing the Panama Canal and the challenges that Glenn and you were speaking a few minutes ago. So that's a very interesting project that is moving ahead, that perhaps it has a chance for a second phase, and we'll see what's going on. It's going to be the second project in the Pacific Basin, the first one in North America. The other one is the Peruvian terminal, which is has a large capacity, but it's very interesting time, the development of this project.
True. Okay, guys. Well, this has been another episode of In a Nutshell, the fortnightly webinar hosted by Natural Gas World, where we look at global news and trends in the gas industry. Thank you very much, and see you next time.